They say that when two souls meet, the entire universe conspires, but nobody warned you what happens when one of them gives up. When the love that seemed written in the stars silently breaks apart, something much bigger than your heart shatters. The very fabric of reality begins to rearrange itself. Carl Jung would call this a symbolic collapse, the moment when the self and the ego lose their rhythm and the collective unconscious moves to rewrite destiny. You feel as if the ground beneath your soul has cracked, but what's happening is even deeper. The spiritual contract has been broken, and the universe is responding. It's not just about losing someone, it's about losing the version of yourself that existed before this encounter. Spirituality and awareness show that when such a bond breaks, time changes shape, the shadow approaches, and synchronicities become confused. Love becomes a mirror, the mirror becomes an abyss, and the abyss, if you have the courage, becomes a portal. You will understand that what left was not punishment, but a summons. Because the soul is not destroyed when the other person leaves, it is forged. And what happens next is something almost no one has the spiritual maturity to face. So, before continuing, get ready. The following words are not for those seeking consolation, they are for those seeking truth. Because what you're about to discover could completely transform how you see love, destiny, and purpose. The breakup wasn't the end. It was the call to the deepest initiation of his existence. Some people enter our lives, and it's as if the entire universe stops to observe. There's a different vibration, an ancient familiarity, a silence laden with meaning. It's not illusion, it's recognition. Before birth, certain souls make agreements on the invisible plane, commitments to mutual awakening, as if saying to each other, "When we meet down there, I will remind you of who you are." These are the so-called spiritual contracts. They are not guided by chance, but by synchronicity, that secret language the universe uses to communicate hidden purposes. Carl Jung described this as the dance between the self and the ego, where life seems to follow a choreography pre-written by the collective unconscious. And the most curious thing is that when these encounters happen, everything around seems to align. The hours coincide, the signs multiply, the dreams gain color. Time suddenly seems to have its own meaning. But what many forget is that these contracts are not promises of romance, but rather pacts for growth. They were not created to comfort the heart, but to expand it. The soul does not seek pleasure, it seeks evolution. When two souls recognize each other, something within each awakens. And this awakening is often painful because it reveals the shadow. That which was hidden, repressed, silenced. The person who arrives with this purpose is like a spiritual mirror. They show you what you need to heal, not what you would like to see. This is why relationships guided by spirituality and consciousness are intense, transformative, and often destabilizing. They force us to look inward and face what the ego has always avoided. The spiritual contract is, in practice, the soul's commitment to fulfilling its mission, even if it requires traversing chaos. The wisest way to recognize that you are facing a spiritual contract is to observe the energy moving within you. Carl Jung taught that the soul speaks through symbols, and synchronicity is the echo of that inner voice. When something or someone makes an impression on you that transcends logic, stop and ask, "What does this experience want to teach me?" This is the question that transforms pain into awareness, recording coincidences, paying attention to dreams, observing recurring emotions. These are all simple practices that sharpen the soul's gaze. The self doesn't need certainties, it needs presence. The ego wants to understand, but consciousness wants to feel. And when you begin to feel life instead of controlling it, the invisible begins to work in your favor. This is how spiritual contracts reveal themselves, not when you seek them, but when you are ready to fulfill them. When a soul decides to break the contract, the entire universe reorganizes itself. Nothing remains the same, neither inside nor outside. What once seemed like destiny transforms into silence, and what once had meaning begins to seem like ruin. Carl Jung said that when an archetype is activated and then denied, the psyche undergoes symbolic collapse. It's as if the collective unconscious reclaims what it had lent to experience. Suddenly, the familiar ground disappears. The person feels they have lost not just someone, but an inner axis. The self and the ego become disconnected. The ego wants to understand. The self wants to transcend. This friction is painful because the breaking of a spiritual contract is not just the loss of a relationship, it is the dissolution of a psychic structure built for awakening. When the other soul gives up, reality mutates. Energy shifts, time seems out of sync, and the body feels what the mind cannot yet explain. The collapse, however, is not punishment. It is a realignment. The universe does not punish. It reorients. When one soul breaks the agreement, the other is pushed inward with an almost divine force. What was once learned in partnership now needs to be discovered in solitude. Spirituality and consciousness become the new refuge, even if initially they seem deserted. Jung observed that the human psyche, faced with the loss of an external function, a bond, a belief, a reference, automatically activates compensatory internal forces. It is the principle of spiritual self-preservation. What comes out must be born from within. That is why the nights after the rupture are so intense. The unconscious is working. Dreams, memories, sensations, and disordered synchronicities begin to emerge. Everything seems out of place, but it is being repositioned. Chaos is not the end of the plan. It is its new form. The most curious thing is that this collapse of reality creates the perfect scenario for the rebirth of consciousness. What seemed like ruin is, in fact, the self dismantling the old scenario to build a new stage for growth. When the ego tries to resist, suffering increases because it still wants to restore what no longer exists. The soul, on the other hand, wants to expand. And when two wills clash, one that wants to return and another that wants to be born, the universe chooses the one that serves the purpose. The shadow begins to appear forcefully, projecting guilt, anger, attachment, resentment. Everything that was hidden by the illusion of connection now demands to be seen. It is at this moment that many give up, confusing purification with punishment. But the wise understand, the pain is only the spiritual body adjusting to the new orbit. The collapse of reality is, in fact, the soul gaining more space within itself. And it is at this breaking point that destiny begins to show its second act. Few realize that even the greatest geniuses of the mind also lived their own spiritual contracts. The story between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud was not merely an intellectual clash. It was an archetypal mirror of how destiny unites and separates souls when a mission needs to change form. Jung saw Freud as a master. Freud saw Jung as an heir. But the collective unconscious, which organizes encounters according to the needs of evolution, had other plans. The rupture between the two was a psychic earthquake. The student broke with the symbolic father, and both were thrown in opposite directions. Jung plunged into the depths of the soul and discovered the self, the shadow, synchronicity, everything that Freud refused to admit for fear of the invisible. Freud represented the rational ego, Jung, the consciousness that dares to traverse the mystery. When the contract between them dissolved, a cycle of modern psychology ended and another, much more spiritual one, began. What Jung experienced with Freud is the same as what many experience with their soulmates, the painful rupture of a shared purpose. When one party resists expansion, the relationship breaks, but the energy continues to demand fulfillment. Freud chose the stability of the known. Jung chose the journey into the unknown. And it's always like that. Life offers each person the chance to choose between security and truth. Jung paid dearly for following his own soul. He was ridiculed, isolated, and plunged into an internal collapse that almost drove him mad. But it was from this abyss that he was reborn, bringing with him the keys to spirituality and consciousness that today underpin all of depth psychology. He proved in his own flesh that the breaking of a spiritual contract can be the beginning of the greatest evolutionary leap of the soul. And that is what differentiates the awakened from the asleep. One breaks and is lost, the other breaks and awakens. The spiritual mentor knows that every significant separation holds a disguised initiation. The end between Jung and Freud was not the collapse of a friendship, but the birth of a new vision of the human soul. The collective unconscious moves like the sea. When one wave recedes, another is forming. When the soul decides to honor the call of the self, it must be willing to disappoint the old gods, including masters, loves, and securities. The ego suffers because it loses control, but the spirit rejoices because it gains freedom. Jung followed the flow of synchronicity, even without knowing where it would lead him, and discovered that spiritual truth never destroys. It only rearranges what no longer fits. The same happens to us. When the other breaks the contract, life forces us to assume the role of creators of our own destiny. And it is in this new role that the soul, finally, begins to remember what it came to fulfill. When a soul breaks the contract, it's sealed before life. The first sensation that arises is one of spiritual orphanhood. It is not ordinary loneliness. It is a cosmic absence, as if an essential part of the very being had been torn away. Carl Jung described this as the experience of archetypal abandonment, when the self and the ego disconnect from the purpose that united them. The individual feels they have lost their own axis. The world keeps turning, but time seems to stand still. The colors, the voices, the places, everything is shrouded in a kind of silence that does not come from outside, but from the depths of the soul. It is mourning for the invisible, for what did not come to pass, but was written in the secret language of the collective unconscious. And it is there that the soul, naked and disoriented, begins to walk without a map, searching for what it can no longer find outside. This feeling of being orphaned is not a mistake. It's a calling. Life uses emptiness to force consciousness to turn inward. The ego wants to run, to distract itself, to replace what it has lost. But the self wants you to stay, feel, and listen. It's the moment when illusions shatter and the shadow begins to reveal itself. You discover that much of what you considered love was, in fact, attachment, and that much of what you called security was disguised fear. This phase is confusing because the heart still seeks the other, but the soul has already begun its return to itself. Spirituality and consciousness do not flourish in comfort. They flourish in helplessness. And it is in this helplessness that the individual begins to encounter their own essence, even if, at first, the encounter hurts. Pain is the birth of new perception. Suffering is the universe's push saying, you were not abandoned, you were redirected. Over time, archetypal orphanhood begins to reveal its own gifts. The sensitive perceive more, the intuitive dream of symbols that seem like messages from beyond. The soul begins to see reality with different eyes, as if it had access to an invisible code that translates what was once a mystery. Carl Jung called this the expansion of consciousness, when emptiness ceases to be a wound and becomes a portal. Synchronicities intensify, signs multiply, and each coincidence seems to murmur that nothing has been lost, only transformed. The individual discovers that the bond has not ended, it has only changed planes. The energy that united them to the other now leads them back to themselves. The soul that feels orphaned is, in fact, being summoned to become its own mother. And it is when it begins to respond to this call that reality, subtly, begins to reconfigure itself, preparing the stage for the second symptom of awakening, the interference of time. After spiritual orphanhood, time ceases to behave as before. The person feels they are living out of rhythm, as if their destiny's path has been bent by invisible hands. What should arrive early is delayed. What should end insists on staying. Carl Jung called this phenomenon synchronic distortion, when the soul continues to vibrate at an old frequency, but external reality has already moved to another stage. It's like trying to tune into a station that no longer exists. The ego insists on restoring the calendar of what was, but the self pushes it towards the time of the soul, the time that doesn't measure hours, but measures meanings. The collective unconscious, when disturbed by a rupture, reorganizes the threads of causality, and coincidences become entangled. You begin to notice signs that seem like messages from the universe, but which arrive late, misaligned, out of sync. It is the cosmos trying to complete a script that the other soul abandoned halfway through. During this period, synchronicity becomes a broken mirror. The fragments still reflect light, but no longer show the whole picture. The individual may dream of the person at the exact moment they are thinking of running away, may receive news from them when they were about to forget them, may feel the other's energy invading their thoughts at improbable times. None of this is delusion, it is spiritual echo. The self and the ego are trying to realign, but still speak different languages. The ego seeks rational closure, the self seeks symbolic integration, and while this transition happens, time folds back on itself. The soul feels nostalgia for the future and a premonition of the past. It is a holy confusion, an alchemy of instants that defies all logic. Spirituality and consciousness demand patience in this territory. It is necessary to accept that the temporal order fragments so that another order, deeper and truer, can emerge. During this temporal interference, the shadow of doubt intensifies. You begin to wonder if everything was real, if the spiritual contract truly existed, or if it was merely imagination. But it is the collective unconscious itself testing your faith in what cannot be seen. The linear mind wants proof, but the soul wants surrender. It's common to feel that time punishes you, but it only teaches you to respect the rhythm of transformation. Everything that was external, plans, encounters, promises, dissolves, and what remains is pure learning. Carl Jung said that the universe reorganizes chaos through symbolism, and the symbol is only born when the old time dies. It is at this point that the soul realizes it hasn't lost its rhythm, it has only changed its tune. And it is this new frequency, slower and quieter, that begins to reveal the third symptom, spectral perception, when the bond transcends space and presence becomes invisible, yet still alive. There are bonds that don't end, they only change dimension. When a soul breaks the spiritual contract, the bond doesn't dissolve. It transforms into an invisible presence. This is called spectral perception, the phenomenon in which the spirit of the other continues to orbit the psychic field even after separation. Carl Jung studied this mystery by observing how the collective unconscious keeps significant connections alive, even without physical contact. The soul feels the absence, but also feels the presence, and the two coexist in an almost unbearable paradox. It's waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone called your name, or smelling a perfume that no one else smells. The self and the ego become confused between the real and the symbolic. The ego tries to rationalize. It's just longing. The self knows it's energetic communication. The vibration of the other's soul continues to exist within you, like a luminous signature that time cannot erase. This perception is both a gift and a burden. Spirituality and consciousness expand because the individual begins to see what most ignore. Life is not limited to the visible. But along with this expansion comes the challenge of distinction. What is intuition and what is illusion? Jung would say that when the psychic energy of a bond is very intense, it generates what we call an autonomous complex, a living form within the mind that thinks, feels, and acts independently. Therefore, even after separation, the soul feels the other, not because it is literally there, but because the energy field still pulsates. It is the remnant of a contract that was not consciously terminated. To dissolve this bond, it is not enough to forget. It is necessary to understand. Consciousness heals what denial imprisons. When you name what you feel, the self reorganizes the energy. When you pretend not to feel, the ego creates phantoms. Therefore, the path is not to deny the invisible, but to learn to relate to it. The shadow manifests when you try to erase the pain and end up feeding it. The wise person, on the contrary, welcomes it. They understand that the love that remains is only the spiritual form of the experience and not an obstacle to freedom. The universe doesn't remove anyone from your life to punish you, but to expand you. The spectral presence is merely a reminder that true love doesn't end. It transforms into consciousness. The other's soul now is a teacher from afar. It teaches you to remain whole even when the mirror disappears. Carl Jung said that what is not integrated becomes destiny, and what is accepted becomes wisdom. When you accept the invisible, the bond is purified. It ceases to be a prison and becomes learning. It is at this point that the spirit begins to free itself from projections, and life slowly prepares the soul for the fourth symptom, forced individuation, where solitude becomes a laboratory of awakening. When the soul loses its mirror, it is forced to become its own reflection. This is where forced individuation begins, the process by which the human being is pushed inward with a force that the ego would never choose of its own accord. Carl Jung said that individuation is the path by which a person becomes who they truly are, integrating light and shadow, reason and instinct, self and ego, spirituality and matter. Normally this process is gradual, full of pauses and learning. But when a spiritual contract is broken, it accelerates almost brutally. Everything that should have been experienced in partnership must now be experienced in solitude. It is the laboratory of the spirit where the heat of suffering distills consciousness. The individual sees themselves before an inner mirror and realizes that they can no longer blame anyone, run from anything, or outsource any pain. Growth ceases to be a choice and becomes destiny. During this phase, spirituality and consciousness expand because the soul begins to understand the difference between solitude and presence. Solitude is not the absence of someone. It is the expanded presence of oneself. Silence, once feared, becomes revelation. Time, once empty, becomes a teacher. Everything that was once external, love, validation, companionship, is replaced by an inner dive that reveals hidden treasures. Jung called this experience the dark night of the psychic soul, the moment when the old self dies so that the new can be born. And curiously, the more the ego tries to resist, the more painful the journey becomes. The self, on the other hand, works in silence, reorganizing the chaos. Each painful memory becomes a symbol, each loss an initiation. It is as if the universe were saying, if the other did not stay to walk beside you, it is because now you are the one who needs to learn to walk with your own soul. Forced individuation is not punishment, it's promotion. The soul is called upon to develop abilities that would never be awakened in comfort. It is the beginning of spiritual autonomy. The individual begins to feel that something greater guides them, an intelligence that seems to come from within and without at the same time. Synchronicities happen again, but now on another level, not to bring people closer, but to align purposes. Coincidences cease to have a face and begin to have direction. The shadow becomes an ally, revealing talents hidden beneath the wounds. Pain begins to be understood as a discipline of the soul, not as punishment. Carl Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is exactly what forced individuation does. It forces you to look at the darkness until it begins to shine. And when the light finally emerges, the soul discovers a new power, that of inner vision, which will manifest in the fifth symptom, the awakening of the oracular function. When the soul passes through the fire of forced individuation and survives, something extraordinary begins to happen. An expanded vision is born within it, a wisdom that cannot be explained, only recognized. It is the awakening of the oracular function, the state in which consciousness becomes capable of perceiving invisible patterns and sensing paths before they reveal themselves. Carl Jung called this capacity the transcendent function, the point where the self and the ego communicate without noise. At this stage, the rational mind falls silent and gives way to profound intuition, that which comes from the collective unconscious and speaks through symbols, dreams, signs, and synchronicities. The individual perceives that the universe is not a set of random events, but a living conversation between the soul and the whole. Synchronicities, once chaotic, now become precise, as if life were guiding them along invisible lines drawn by divine wisdom itself. This new perception is not a gift, it is a consequence. It is the silent reward granted to those who have endured losing everything except faith. By traversing pain and integrating the shadow, the human being gains access to more subtle dimensions of reality. Spirituality and consciousness are refined, and the gaze becomes capable of seeing what was previously hidden in the subtext of existence. Suddenly, the individual begins to sense when something is about to happen, senses people's energy before they speak, understands what others are experiencing, even without hearing a word. Jung observed that souls who undergo great spiritual ruptures often develop this expanded perception, not as magic, but as a result of the broadening of the psyche's field. It is wisdom born from the wound. Suffering opens cracks through which the light of understanding enters. The awakened being begins to perceive the world as a living network of meanings, where everything is interconnected. Over time, this oracular function becomes a spiritual compass. The soul learns to trust the invisible and follow the flow of the self without demanding proof from the ego. The individual understands that the future doesn't need to be predicted, only felt. The heart becomes a radar, intuition, a map, and the inner voice, the true oracle. This awakening doesn't distance them from the world. It brings them closer to it, but at a different frequency. Now, they see human suffering with compassion, repetitions with clarity, and choices with lightness. Carl Jung said that those who integrate the shadow become wounded healers, those who guide others because they have learned to decipher their own pain. And that's exactly what happens here. The inner oracle ignites, not to predict destinies, but to illuminate consciousness. The awakened being becomes a mirror for those who still sleep, a guide for those who still seek, a beacon for those who are still lost. And it is at this point that the journey takes a new turn. Suffering ceases to be a personal story and transforms into a spiritual mission. After traversing the desert of the soul, the awakened being discovers that nothing was in vain. Every loss, every silence, every absence had a hidden purpose, to transform it into an instrument of consciousness. Carl Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is exactly what happens here. Suffering is transmuted into wisdom. Pain becomes direction. What once seemed like punishment is now a vocation. The individual begins to realize that their history carries a code and that the wounds were not obstacles, but portals. The shadow becomes an ally, the ego learns to serve the self, and spirituality and consciousness gain new density. They cease to be theory and become living practice. The soul understands that it came into the world not only to learn, but to teach, not through beautiful words, but through its own presence. The energy that was once spent in lamentation now becomes silent magnetism, the kind that inspires without needing to convince. At this point, life ceases to be something that happens to me and becomes something that happens through me. The human being who has reconnected with the self becomes a channel of the collective unconscious, expressing in their journey what all of humanity needs to understand. Synchronicities multiply again, but now with clarity. People, messages, opportunities, and challenges appear as perfect pieces on the mission board. Spirituality and consciousness take the form of service. Not servitude, but contribution. The individual understands that their role is not to save anyone, but to ignite paths within those who have not yet awakened. Their presence, shaped by pain and honed by faith, begins to carry the frequency of Jung's wounded healer, the one who heals not because they escaped pain, but because they learned to traverse it. Suffering, when integrated, becomes applied wisdom. This is the true alchemy of the soul, transforming wound into source, loss into power, chaos into consciousness. When this happens, the ego ceases to seek control and begins to serve the greater harmony of the self. The awakened being understands that nothing has been taken from them, everything has been returned in another form. The love that was lost in the human has been rediscovered in the divine. The pain that tore them apart was the scalpel of consciousness that freed them. And so, the soul finally understands the meaning of the journey. It did not come into the world to have a perfect life. It came to become a bridge between the visible and the invisible. The collective unconscious now recognizes it as an instrument. It speaks, and the universe responds. It feels and time moves. This is the transmutation of destiny, when suffering ceases to be a memory and becomes a mission. And it is at this point that the cycle begins to close, preparing the soul for the final stage, the final calling, when it understands that the learning was not about the other, but about the eternity of its own spirit. There comes a point when the soul, healed from the shock and matured by the journey, realizes that the true purpose of the spiritual contract was not the bond itself, but the awakening it would provoke. Everything that seemed like loss reveals itself as liberation. Carl Jung said that what we resist persists, what we accept transforms. When the individual accepts their own path as an expression of the self, the ego ceases to fight against reality and begins to cooperate with it. It is here that the final calling is born, the silent voice that does not ask, but guides. This voice comes from the soul, and it does not speak of promises, it speaks of duty. It is the spiritual duty to use everything that has been learned to serve the world. After so much immersion in its own waters, consciousness realizes that the love it sought outside was always within, and that the other was merely the messenger who would lead it back to itself. It is at this point that the soul understands the true meaning of spirituality and consciousness. It is not escape, it is surrender. The final calling arrives when you no longer feel the need to understand the why of things, only the natural impulse to do the good that needs to be done. The collective unconscious now manifests organically. People who cross your path are answers, opportunities are invitations, and synchronicities become precise compasses. The soul begins to live in harmony with the invisible intelligence of the universe. Jung called this alignment with the self, the point where inner and outer life move in the same rhythm. There is no longer a division between spiritual and mundane, because the spirit has become part of everything. The individual who arrives here does not seek recognition. They seek coherence. They become a healing presence, without needing to call themselves a healer. And their strength comes not from what they do, but from who they are. They become a living witness to their own integration, a reminder that the human being can cross the shadow and emerge whole. At this stage, suffering ceases to have a function. It dissolves into meaning. The awakened being begins to radiate what it has learned: awareness, serenity, and discernment. It understands that every spiritual contract, even the broken one, fulfills its role in the greater plan of evolution. The ego no longer seeks love. It serves love. The shadow no longer frightens. It becomes a bridge to the light. And the self, finally, fully expresses itself in the world, as if the universe breathed through it. This is the apex of the journey, when pain transforms into wisdom and wisdom into service. The soul now knows that destiny is not a place, but a state of being. And it is in this state that the spiritual mission arises, to live so consciously that existence itself becomes prayer. When this happens, the wheel closes. The contract has been fulfilled, even if it was broken, because the true agreement was never with the other, but with the soul's own eternity. Now you understand, nothing was a mistake. The spiritual contract hasn't ended. It has merely changed form. The soul that wounded you initiated you. The loss that broke you prepared you. And the silence that hurt you was the portal through which your conscience passed. Carl Jung said that true awakening begins when the ego bows before the self. When you stop asking life to spare you and start asking it to reveal itself to you. The collective unconscious is full of souls trapped in the same cycle, repeating patterns, seeking salvation in others, fleeing from their own reflection. But you got this far because your soul decided otherwise. She doesn't want anesthesia. She wants lucidity. So listen carefully. You weren't abandoned. You were promoted. He was called to live with spirituality and awareness, not as a theory, but as a daily practice. Every choice you make from now on needs to honor what you've discovered. When the shadow comes, don't run away. Talk to it. When fear arises, don't fight it and observe it. When love returns, don't get lost. Awaken with it. Your mission is not to rebuild the past. It's about building the kind of presence that even time cannot erase. And if this resonated with you, it's because the contract was fulfilled, not with the other soul, but with your own destiny. Now tell me, you'll keep reliving the same cycle, or will you transform everything you've learned into real spiritual strength? If this message touched you, if your soul felt this calling, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each video is a key, and each key unlocks a new dimension of your consciousness. The next step in your journey begins when you decide to stay awake.